Hi, I'm here with Gwendolyn Church, who is the founder of Friends of Philip Fish Sanctuary, a nonprofit fish and aquatic sanctuary in Reno, Nevada. And today we're going to talk about some of the work that Friends of Philip does to rescue fish and educate the public on their lives and their care. I'm so grateful that you can speak with us and share some of your knowledge.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
So can you start by telling us a bit about Philip? I know he was a Betta that you rescued from one of those big chains. Could you talk about his story and how rescuing him led to the development of the organization that you have today?
Of course. Yeah, like you said, Friends of Philip. Philip was a betta, and he was our first rescue from a large chain store, and it was the story that at this point is very, very common for our organization and for many people who rescue bettas, which is um, I had heard online that sometimes chain stores and pet stores generally will surrender a fish who's not doing well. Um, and I was at a pet store. I saw this little betta on the back of a shelf, just like looking awful. I mean, I was pretty new to fish. At the time, I'd been really researching how to care for bettas and the nitrogen cycle and a lot of the things that you need to know, um, sort of with the hope that I could one day rescue a betta if I ever found one who needed it. And I came across him in the store, and it was, even to me being pretty inexperienced at that point, it was really, really apparent that he was in awful shape. He was incredibly thin. His fins were just completely rotted away. He was pale, and even without any experience or really knowing what I was looking for, it was obvious that he was sick and that he wasn't going to recover if he stayed at the store. Um, so I took him off of the shelf. I asked an employee if I could adopt him, and they said yes. And so then I suddenly had this little fish, and I took him out of the store with me, and I did it a little backwards, which this is never the way that I would encourage people to rescue an animal, but I didn't have a tank or anything. So I ran to another store very quickly and got all the supplies that I needed, and went home and got him set up in his tank. Um, and so, I say that's not the way that I would do it, and that's definitely not the way that I think people should typically rescue an animal. But I did have a really thorough understanding of what I needed to do. I knew all about the nitrogen cycle. I knew about the tank that he needed. I knew about how to monitor water quality and all of the things that I needed to do to keep him healthy. I just didn't have the equipment at the time. So um, I went and got the equipment. I took him home, got him acclimated, and then did it's called like a fish-in cycle process, which is a lot more work than just having the tank fully established, but is kind of also one of the only ways sometimes to do it with a new rescue like that. So um, Philip did surprisingly well. Like I look back at the photos of him now, and I'm honestly a little bit surprised that he pulled through, because if I brought him home today, um, I would not be surprised if he didn't make it. That's just the condition that he was in.
Mhm.
Um, so luckily he recovered beautifully. He did really, really well. And watching him recover and seeing that process was just kind of this moment of like, oh, I could actually kind of do this. I have some more space. I have the time and the resources to take care of more tanks and more fish. And so it just kind of started to grow organically from there.
So what types of fish do you care for at the sanctuary now? Because you've expanded over the years to care for other types of fish and animals.
Yeah, so we have, gosh, over like 25 species of fish. Um, and so that includes a number of species of corridor catfish, who are just the adorable little catfish. They stay about this big. We've got a few different species of plecos, who are also catfish. We have some loaches of different varieties. We have minnows, goldfish, bettas, of course, tetras, danios, some cichlids, kind of a pretty large variety. And then our most recent new species is a bluegill, who came home a few months ago.
And do a lot of them come from the pet stores, or do people find out about your services and then seek to surrender their fish with you?
It tends to vary. Most of the bettas. Actually, I think all of the bettas except one who we currently have came from pet stores. So those are the same situation as Philip of being given as a free surrender. We would, of course, never buy them. So that's the most common for bettas. For the tropical fish and the goldfish, it's much more common that we have kind of a caregiver surrender, and then we also actually partner with our local animal services. So our bluegill resident Tommy, and then some, maybe 9 of our goldfish came from the local animal services as well.
I know a lot of people have the experience of going into those pet chains and then seeing the bettas in the cups, and they look pretty miserable. Can you talk about some of your own experiences with seeing bettas at these chain stores? What like behavioral or physical signs in those bettas shows you that it's not a healthy way of displaying them?
Yeah. I mean, at the most basic level, I can think of maybe a handful of times that I've gone into any pet store, whether it's a large chain or a fish store or a store that only sells betta, anything like that, and have not seen a dead betta in one of those cups. Um, and that on its own, I've been into those stores dozens and dozens of times, and there is always at least one dead betta. Same thing with the tanks on the walls. There's always dead fish, always. So that on its own, if you walked into anywhere and you just saw like a dead hamster in a cage, people would freak out. But with the bettas and things, it's so common, and they're just kind of treated as garbage at that point. And so that's a big one. But there's definitely, tons of indicators. I mean, if you look at the behavior of a betta in an aquarium who's healthy and happy and receiving proper care, they're moving around a ton. Their colors are very bright. They're active and inquisitive, and they follow you and look at you and are asking you for attention and usually for treats. And they're very interactive, very inquisitive, interesting fish. They're fascinating to watch and so fun to interact with and very personable. And then when you look at these fish in the cups, you never see that behavior. I've only occasionally maybe seen a betta who even kind of recognizes that someone's watching them. And really it's just kind of looking over, and not responding or displaying any of what I would consider to be very normal, healthy betta behavior.
Mhm.
And then, of course, tied with that, there's all of the classic things of you see them floating at the top of the cups, you see them stuck at the bottom of the cups, you see them unable to regulate their kind of stability. So they might be, tipping over or floating on their side. You see tons of uneaten food, which is very unusual for bettas because they love to eat. You see incredibly pale colors, just, these washed out, pale looking fish, which is very, I would say abnormal for bettas because they do have very vibrant colors. And then, of course, physically you'll see injuries are somewhat uncommon of to see, like I've seen actual giant abrasions and things on the bettas, but I would say that that's less common. Much more common are things like really bad fin rot, fin tears, holes, entire missing fins. We just actually lost our little betta Strawberry, and she was surrendered because she didn't have a tail in that cup at the store. So all kinds of kind of physical injuries or the results of poor water quality, like fin rot and things like that.
Yeah, and I know you have tested the water parameters in those cups. I've done it too, and
Yeah.
it's terrible, like really high, sometimes off the charts, ammonia, off the
Yeah.
charts nitrate. And
Yeah.
that's just extremely toxic and also so unrealistic for these stores to be able to maintain like even tolerable conditions. They're
Absolutely.
selling like 60 or more bettas, and
Hmm.
the staff are not, they're not there just to care for the bettas. They're doing a million other things.
Exactly. Yeah, they have all of the other animals to care for. And I mean, if you're keeping a betta in like, that's like the equivalent of like a glass of water that we might just drink at, with dinner or something. And like, if you're keeping a fish in something like that, that water needs to be changed at least every day, ideally more. The only time I would ever have a fish in that amount of water is like for transport. And in those cases, it means the fish just came out of their tank, they're being transported however far, and then they're immediately going to go into a new tank. And even with that, if when we were moving from Sonoma County to Reno, it's about 4 hours. And so we had to be very cognizant of the fact that we're keeping our fish in small amounts of water for some period of time, and that the water quality is going to start to get bad. And that's, they're not being fed. They just came out of a clean tank. We know the water quality is good to start with, and it's a very short time, but it's still a big concern. So when they're in there permanently and that's where they're eating, it's just the water quality gets atrociously bad so fast. All of the worst water quality that I've seen has been in those cups from the stores.
Yeah. Something that strikes me is I hear a lot from people who are in different countries, like the UK, Germany, and the Netherlands, and they're just shocked that this is our standard practice, because I think it's illegal, or it's just not done there. And so it's like we just sort of accept that this is the way it has to be done. We just think that they're aggressive fish, they can't be kept in bigger tanks, so they have to be in those cups. But it can be done, and it is being done differently. So it's really
Absolutely.
unfortunate.
It is, yeah. And I don't know the laws, but I do know exactly, like you said, that like people in other countries are appalled when they see that this is our standard. Um, and yeah, the very common thing, exactly like you said, is that, oh, these fish are far too aggressive to live together. And that's true. And you shouldn't keep bettas together. And there are also definitely ways to keep more than one betta and keep them healthy and safe. And like we have several dozen small tanks that each have one betta in them. And that's perfectly doable. But a store isn't going to want to invest the time and the space and the money really ultimately into providing those kind of conditions when they can just keep them in these little cups and still make money off of them.
Yeah. Yeah. And so if someone goes into one of these pet stores and is just shocked by what they see and the conditions of the bettas, do you have any tips for what they can do in that moment, or any recommendations? Like, should they approach the staff, or is there anything that you think just an individual can do in that moment at those stores to help?
Unfortunately, it's really hard to be able to do much in those specific situations. In my experience, the thing that you can do is if you see one fish or a group of fish who are obviously doing poorly, which that's all of them, so it's hard to choose, but it is usually possible to approach the employees and at least get like a water change done for those ones. Um, it's not much, but it does help, to at least alleviate their suffering a little bit in the moment. If you're in the position and interested, you can always try to adopt, but of course, I would never suggest that anyone do that impulsively or without the understanding of what they need to do to be able to take care of that fish long term and make sure that they're healthy and safe. Um, and yeah, I think, talking to employees and managers, ultimately the people who work at the store have very, very little control over the conditions the animals are kept in. It is going to be something that comes from, especially like for those large stores, from the kind of corporate side. I think of, for example, PetSmart, in the last few years, I can't remember exactly when, at some point PetSmart like revamped their betta display, and instead of making things actually good for the fish, they decided to install these light fixtures where each little cup with the betta has this horrifyingly bright light underneath it, with the idea that they're going to display the fish and make them look more appealing. And all that it does is stress the heck out of the fish and make them all miserable. So I've been to PetSmart stores where like the employees have put paper in between the light and the cups, or they've moved the cups off to the side, or they even just don't turn the lights on. So there's things like that you can ask them to do. But ultimately, I think, we do have to recognize that the employees have very little control over the situation. And, I've seen a lot online that people will get very angry and say really, really aggressive things about the employees, hopefully not to them, but like about them online and things like that, saying, oh, how could you ever do this? And we have to acknowledge that it's not their choice. And so, the things that I think might be a bit more effective in terms of applying pressure to the corporation itself is to leave really bad Google reviews, leave terrible Yelp reviews. Say, I went in here and I saw all these dead fish and this is unacceptable. Write to the corporate, send emails to the corporate groups, ask to speak to the manager and say that you really want your feedback to be passed on. things like that to try to apply a bit more pressure to the actual corporation and the people who are really driving the decisions about how the animals are treated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know like so many of these employees are some of the biggest supporters and people calling for change, and they hate
Absolutely.
what they see. And I also think it's just kind of convenient for the corporate if we blame the employees, because then they can act like, oh, this is an individual isolated case, and
Yep.
deflect any sort of responsibility off of them,
Yeah.
when really it's extremely systemic and widespread. On more of a broader scale, what kinds of advocacy and efforts would you want to see more of, like in order to create like a more societal change for bettas to improve their welfare? Like, do you think there needs to be more like boycotting or like legal efforts? Or what
Hmm.
would you like to see more of?
I think boycotting is the easiest stop, right? It's if the more people who we can encourage and convince to not buy animals from pet stores, period, um, the better. Like that's always going to be better because the more the stores lose money on these animals, the better that will be. The challenge with that, of course, is that like if a store is selling a Betta for $3, the thing that they're really making money on is you also buying the bowl and the plants and all of the other stuff. So it's a little bit hard, but now that we have more options, companies like Chewy, I'm not saying that Chewy is the best company in the world, but they don't sell animals. And so, when there's places like that that we can get pet supplies and equipment to keep our animals our companion animals safe and happy without having to support a store that sells animals, that's a really great thing to encourage people to do. Um, at the same time, I think, the animal rescue world generally has always focused on cats and dogs, and the other companion animals typically get pushed to the wayside. We're continuing to see more advocacy for animals like rabbits and guinea pigs and the small mammals and stuff. And so I think just including fish more in the conversation of around animal rescue and animal advocacy. And the same thing with like vegan organizations. There's all kinds of sanctuaries and things who do excellent, excellent work for terrestrial farmed animals, and then fish are kind of excluded from their messaging. And I think most of the time it's not a malicious thing. It's just that fish are by far kind of the most ignored of the animals that we exploit and that we keep either in our homes or that we consume. So I think encouraging organizations to do that, organizations like yours, where you're specifically focusing on bettas and advocating for improvement to their welfare, I think is just amazing because it just gives people another thing to think about. I think most people have never really considered the idea that adoption for a fish could even be an option. So making that, something that people know more about, trying to spread that message more, I think is always going to be helpful.
And so I've been following your Instagram account for a long time, and I love the stories that you share of your residents. And they're so beautifully written, and they really help
Thank
to
you.
see these fish and these animals as individuals. So I wondered if you could share, just one story about a particular fish, um, or any sort of story that you feel is unique or special to you.
Yeah. One of my favorite stories is about our goldfish. Actually, she was our first common goldfish. Her name is Goldie. We try whenever possible to keep the names that the previous family had for the fish, so that's where her name came from. Um, Goldie, like many, many goldfish, was won as a fair prize. Um, and she was one of the lucky few because she went to a family that actually really cared about her, and tried very hard to give her the best care that they could. Um, and even with that, her story was still kind of sad because she lived alone for about 5 years. Um, and she was healthy and one of the most like social goldfish I've ever seen with people, because her people were interacting with her all the time and things. But they didn't know that, goldfish are incredibly social and really need other goldfish to live with. So, gosh, I guess it was maybe 3 years ago now at this point. Her family reached out to me on social media and asked if we would be interested in Goldie coming to Sanctuary. And so I was kind of in this moment of like, oh gosh, we don't have any other goldfish. I need to figure out how to take care of a common goldfish and how to provide them with what they need. But we did bring in Goldie, and we set up a stock tank for her, and quickly were able to adopt some, rescue some other goldfish. Because goldfish, they're the easiest fish to find on Craigslist, and people are always giving away goldfish. Um, so we found Goldie some friends, and then for the first time, for in years, she had friends, which was amazing to see because goldfish really are just so incredibly social. So watching her get to go from being this kind of lonely goldfish to now having a whole group of friends. And she, of course, moved with us to Reno and continued to be the most social of our goldfish. She would come up to the top and say hi every single time I walked out, and she'd like kiss your fingers when you put them on the top of the water, and it's very sweet. Um, and then she was part of the first group of goldfish who moved into our big pond here. So she's kind of gone through all of the stages of Friends of Philip goldfish keeping. But she is honestly the reason I think that I've completely fallen in love with goldfish. They're my favorite fish species. And it's just because they're so sweet and incredible to watch the way that they interact with and care for each other, and then the way that they'll interact with me as well, and how social and friendly they are. So it was wonderful to be able to kind of see and facilitate her transition from being very isolated and lonely to now having this whole group of friends. And then of course her story is an excellent example of why like goldfish shouldn't be fair prizes. I mean, I feel like that should go unsaid, but unfortunately it does need to be said. But we have a number of goldfish here now who were won originally as prizes at a fair or carnival or whatever. And people get them when they're about this big, and then they grow. A common goldfish can get to be over 12 inches long. So they get huge. They can live for 20 years. They have incredibly intensive and often expensive care requirements that people just aren't aware of. So I try to share as much as I can about our goldfish, in part to encourage people, of course, to encourage people not to buy them, but also to make sure that people know really what they're getting into if they choose to rescue goldfish.
Do you have any suggestions or tips for someone who might like to start a micro sanctuary and do some of the work that you do? Like, what are some realistic things for them to consider?
Yeah. The main thing I would say, a micro sanctuary can look like anything. It can be someone living with 2 house chickens. It can be someone with one fish, one betta that they've rescued. And so I think the main thing to keep in mind is like what is realistic for you in your situation. And also what are the resources that you have available. We are incredibly, incredibly lucky to have access to an absolutely phenomenal aquatic vet, and many people do not have that kind of access. I don't think that must stop you from rescuing fish if you want to rescue fish, but I think that it's something that you need to think very critically about, because for fish in particular, there's all kinds of just like rampant misinformation online. People will diagnose diseases that they don't even know the name of, prescribe medications that they don't know how they work, and then be surprised that the fish didn't make it. And that's just normal for fish keeping and for the aquarium hobby, as they call it. You can buy all kinds of unregulated antibiotics from fish stores and just dump them in your fish tank. And you're exposing yourself to these unknown medications, you're exposing the fish to them. And really that's not a responsible way to care for an animal. And that's really hard though, because then if the alternative is that you don't have access to a vet at all, it puts people in this really challenging position. So, it's something to think very critically about. If you're interested in rescuing fish or any animal, if you want to rescue chickens, but you don't have access to a vet who knows anything about chickens, you're going to be in a similar position. So it's really, really important to try to figure out, what vets are in your area. Is there a vet who you can work with who might be interested in learning more about fish? Our vet does consultations with non-aquatic vets to help them treat fish. And so there's options out there. But the veterinary care aspect is very, very critical to consider and kind of be aware of. I didn't even know that aquatic vets existed when I first rescued Philip. I just kind of didn't know that they were even a thing, and it took me a while to finally kind of stumble across aquatic vets as an option. And then I just got very, very lucky with the access that we do have. So, I wouldn't say that you can't rescue fish if you don't have access to a vet. I just think that you need to be really aware of what you're going into and know what you're going to do when a fish needs more help than you can provide. So that's that's the big thing I try to emphasize, just because fish medical care is complicated and difficult to access. Otherwise, I think the big thing to emphasize is just knowing your own limits and what you can reasonably take on and take care of. And I think that if you're going to rescue one Betta and give them the absolute best life that you can, that's much better than rescuing 5 and giving them like not the best care. So always keeping within your limits and your resources and making sure that you're really prioritizing the lives and the quality of life of the individuals in your care.
And then my last question is just how can people support Friends of Philip and the work that you do?
I mean, the best way I would say to support what we're trying to do is to just try to talk more about fish. If you're in the privileged position to have influence at something like an animal rights organization or a rescue organization, work with the people who run that organization to include fish in your messaging. If you work at the Humane Society, work with the Humane Society to set up an aquarium to have there so that someone could adopt a fish through the Humane Society. There's all kinds of things that people can do if they have that kind of access or privilege. And for, people who aren't working in that space, I think the big thing is to kind of do the same thing. Just keep talking about fish. If you know someone in your life who has a fish or who wants a fish, have the conversation with them about rescuing and pursuing that as an option instead of buying a fish. The basic things of course, don't buy fish from stores. Encourage other people not to buy fish from stores. And then, for supporting us directly, if people follow on social media and share our posts and our messaging and things, that's a huge help. We have a number of links through our social media as well to donate and help support our residents, and that goes directly to largely their vet care. That's our main expense. And so that's always very helpful and appreciated as well.
And I can include all of those links in the video description too.
Perfect. Thank you.
So yeah, just thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. And I'm just so inspired by you as an individual and your knowledge and your dedication. And I'm so excited to watch Friends of Philip continue to grow.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a pleasure to be on here. I love your account too. Honestly, I think you do such a good job of showing just how terrible everything is around how bettas are kept and the way that they're treated. So I really appreciate you taking the time to have me on.